Hey everyone, it's good to, I guess it's good to be seen since I can't see everybody, but I'm glad to have everybody on the presentation today. And we thought we would take some time today, which we haven't done in a while, but to give an update on the Paycheck Protection Loan Program, but really to do the update through a detailed review of the PPP forgiveness application, both the full version and the EZ version. So we'll be, during the review of the application, we'll be giving some updates on some interim guidance that's been provided, some answers that have been, some questions that have been answered, and maybe some questions that we still have. So to do that, we have two of my colleagues that are going to really run with this, Kate Schmelowick, who's with our business department, and Liz Lehman, who is also with our business department. Since they've got the meat of the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Liz to get going on the review of the application.
All right, thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for being here today. So we are going to go through the full application with a set of numbers that we have created. So we're going to go through that together. The application is divided into three general portions. There's the first calculation form, and then there's Schedule A. And then there's a Schedule A worksheet that includes tables 1 and 2. So we're going to begin with the calculation form, but then we're actually going to go backwards, and we're going to go from the bottom up. We're going to start with the worksheet and then work our way back up to the calculation form. So after we complete this full application, we're going to touch upon the EZ application, and then we're also going to go through some documentation requirements. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Prior slide, please, Kathy. Thank you. Okay, so here's the beginning of the loan forgiveness application form, which is the calculation form itself. You're going to enter in your business identifying information. You're going to enter in your PPP loan number, your lender's PPP loan number, your PPP loan amount. For purposes of this, for today's webinar, we've chosen the amount of $125,000. You're going to then insert your PPP loan disbursement date. That's the date of which you actually received the money. Here we picked May 1st. You're going to indicate the number of employees you had at the time of your loan application, and then also the employees at the time of your forgiveness application. Then you're going to list your economic injury disaster loan advance amount if applicable. So the CARES Act authorized that an advance amount for the EIDL authorize an amount up to $10,000. While this forgiveness application did not calculate that advance amount, your lender will reduce the amount of this advance from your eligible forgiveness amount. Then you enter in your EIDL application number if applicable. Next slide, please. All right, now we're going to go slightly down on the first page to the payroll schedule and covered period information. First, you select your the frequency of which your payroll is paid to your employees, and in this example we picked twice a month. Then we're going to go to the covered period, of which we're going to reference a lot during this application. So the covered period starts on the day and includes the day of which your loan was dispersed to you. So here in this covered period, it starts on May 1st. Now the length of the covered period is either 8 weeks or 24 weeks. So for borrowers who obtained a loan prior to June 5th, you have the option to choose between the 8-week and the 24-week period. Apologies if I said 12-week, 24-week. For borrowers after June 5th, you are limited to the 24-week period. So here we have selected the 8-week period, and it includes from May 1st through June 25th. Now there's also the alternative payroll covered period. The SBA has determined that certain eligible payroll costs may be paid or incurred during the covered period, and as such, for borrowers who have a bi-weekly or more frequent pay period, so only bi-weekly folks, not twice a month folks, they may elect a covered period that begins on the first day of the first pay period following the disbursement date. So if we had selected the alternative payroll covered period, if we were bi-weekly pairs, we would go from May 1st and we would go to the first day of the first full pay period following May 1st, and then go out 8 or 24 weeks from that date. All right, lastly in this section, you just check that box if your loan exceeds $2 million. Now I'm going to turn to Kate, who's going to go into the worksheet.
Okay, next slide. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Liz. So the easiest way to go through the application is actually to go backwards and then forwards. So if anybody following along on this webinar has an application that they've got up or they've got printed, you're going to flip to the very last, the last page, not the quite last page, that's actually demographic information, but the second to last page, so page 4, which is the PPP Schedule A worksheet that you can see we have up on the screen here. And there's 2 tables that you can see. So the first table is going to relate to employees who earn more than who earn less than $100,000 per year. Table 2 is employees who earn more than $100,000 a year. So you can see the big difference between the 2 tables is the last column is not present in Table 2 compared to Table 1, where there's a salary and wage reduction column. This is because employees who earn more than $100,000, if they have their salaries or hourly wages cut, and they're still above $100,000 even after that cut, it does not affect your loan forgiveness reduction calculations. All right, so column 1 is your employee's name. So you're going to list on both Table 1 and Table 2 employees whose principal place of residence is in the United States and all these people who are actually employees. So not employee owners. That's very important in here. They do not go on these charts. So column 1, employee names. Column 2, employee identifiers, so their social security, the last 4 of their social security numbers. Column 3 is going to be cash compensation. So what you're going to put into this box is the cash compensation that was paid to the employees during your covered period or your alternative covered period. Keep in mind, this is cash compensation, so this is not your benefits, your health insurance, things like that employees may receive as well. It's just their wages, salaries, that type of cash compensation. Keep in mind, again, there is the limits on cash compensation based on either the 8-week period or the 24-week period. We have those caps that we've previously talked about in other webinars, which is really more going to come into play down in Table 2. So the next column is going to be your average FTE headcounts. So we're going to go through that in a few minutes here of how to calculate that, but you're going to place, after we finish those calculations, you're going to place those calculations into the 4th column. And then the last column in Table 1 is the salary, hourly, and salary wage reduction calculation. Again, we're going to go through that here in a few minutes, but once you're done, you're going to place that in that last column in Table 1. Again, you don't have to do that for Table 2. Next slide, please. Okay. So the next slide here is talking about the salary and hourly wage calculation. So there is, as we've mentioned in other webinars, there is a safe harbor for the wage reduction. So first we have to determine if the safe harbor has been met. So step 1, as you see here, is whether the pay was reduced more than 25% compared to January 1, 2020 through March 31, 2020's average. So here we're using a salary calculation, and we're going to go through that here in the next slide. But here we're using the employee A, which they were making during this January 1 to March 31 time period, $80,000. So now let's look at step 2, whether the salary and hourly wage reduction safe harbor has been met. So was the average annual salary or hourly wage between February 15th, 2020 and April 26th, 2020 equal to or greater to the February 15th average? And then the next step is the average annual salary or hourly wage restored to February 2020 levels by the date of this application or December 31, 2020. If not, then you would have to, the safe harbor has not been met and you would have to move to the reduction calculation. So here for this employee, their January through March levels were $80,000 for their average salary, and they were cut to $56,000, which was more than 25%. And at the time of the application, because let's say we're making the application as of today, June 29th, they have not been restored to their $80,000 threshold. So here, the safe harbor has not been met. As a practical matter, because of the date of the application or the December 31 date, employers may want to consider holding off on submitting for forgiveness if they anticipate rehiring some of their employee or restoring some of their employee salaries sometime within the next couple of months. That way they may be able to qualify for the safe harbor. So that's something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, so since the safe harbor has not been met, here we're going to have to do the salary and hourly wage calculation. So as you can see here, step one is multiplying the January 1 through March 31, 2020 average salary, or if you're using an hour, and if they're hourly employees, you're going to use their average hourly wage, which, you know, could be whatever, $15 an hour, $20 an hour. And you're going to multiply that by 0.75. So here at the bottom, you can see that the average salary was $80,000 times 0.75 equals $60,000. And then, so you're going to subtract that $60,000 from the salary or hourly wage during the covered period one. So here it's going to be 60 minus 56, which is what they were cut to, which equals 4. We're going to skip down to number 4 because we're talking about a salary calculation now. You're going to multiply that number by 24 if you have a 24-week covered period, or 8 if you have an 8-week covered period. And then you're going to divide that number by 52. Whatever number you come up with is what you're going to place in that last column on table 1. So that's for the salary. For hourly, it's very similar. That's number 3, except of course you'd be using the hourly wage instead of the average annual salary. So you're going to have to go through this for each employee. So as you can see on the application, there's only a couple boxes there. So if you have extra employees, you can attach a separate Excel spreadsheet that has the same type of boxes and calculations in it. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've now figured out what our salary and wage reduction calculations are. So now we can move on to the average FTE calculation. So for each employee, again, we're doing this for every single one of the employees, you're going to enter the average number of hours paid per week, divide that number by 40, and then round the totals to the nearest 10th. The maximum for each employee is capped at 1. So we've had questions about if an employee works 50 hours a week or 60 hours a week, is it more than 1? And the answer is no, you're capped at 1 for each employee. If you don't want to go through that calculation, you can use a simplified method, which assigns a 1 for employees that work 40 hours and a 0.5 for employees who work less than 40 hours. We've suggested to clients to run the numbers both ways to see what is more accurate and what gives a higher FTE calculation. For employers who have employees who are really in between the 20-hour and the 40-hour mark, it may not make sense to use a simplified method, but that's something that you can run the numbers and see what works best for your business. However, when you do that, you want to make sure that if you use the simplified method for the covered period calculation, you also use the simplified method for your look back period. If you don't, then you can't really, it's going to be problematic. You can't use one type of calculation for the one period and a different type of calculation for the other. They need to match. Okay, so let's look at the example now. So for an employee who was furloughed for 4 weeks during the first part of the covered period, and then was offered to come back to work to come off of furlough for the last 4 weeks at 40 hours a week, you're going to see here that there's going to be zeros for the first 4 weeks and then 1s for the last 4 weeks. So the total there is going to be 4. This is easy math for me. I really like this math. And then you're going to divide that by 8 because we have a 8-week covered period. And then so the total for this person is going to be 0.5. So again, you're going to go through this and do this calculation for each employee, both in table 1 and Table 2 compared to the salary calculations you only did in Table 1. Okay, next slide, please, Kathy. Okay, so the same thing with the salary safe harbor. There are safe harbors for FTE reductions. You've heard us talk about this before on other webinars. There are 2 safe harbors related to FTE calculations. So the first is if employers, were unable to operate between February 15th and the end of the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th, 2020, due to OSHA, CDC, HHS, or state or local shutdown orders. The second safe harbor is for FTEs as of the earlier of December 31 or the date of the application is greater than or equal to the FTEs on February 5th during the February 15th pay period. So there's a few other exceptions too. We've talked about these de minimis exceptions to your FTE headcount. So this was actually a big change that we've seen in the past probably week and a half or 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. The time has been blending together with all of the updates. So the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, which I know some of the viewers here have heard me talk about before, brought 2 new FTE reduction exceptions, which were slightly, which one was completely new about the OSHA regs in compliance with OSHA and CDC regs. The other one was slightly changing a previous de minimis exception that the SBA had issued in one of their interim rules. In the past 2 weeks, the SBA has clarified that the previous rule that they had made regarding that particular de minimis exception has been superseded by the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act's rule. So now we have a new additional affirmative obligation. So the first exception is going to be what you see here on the screen: any position for which the borrower made a good faith written offer to rehire an individual who was an employee on February 15th, and the borrower was unable to hire a similarly qualified employee for that unfilled position on or before December 31, 2020. So now there is an affirmative obligation to try hiring a similarly qualified individual to fill that spot. If you are unable to fill it and have made good faith attempts to do so, then you can still count this exception and it won't affect your FTE headcounts. But there is now this new affirmative obligation. There's also still the affirmative obligation that if an employee refuses to come back to work, to report that refusal to the local unemployment office. I know I mentioned probably a month ago when that rule had come out that we were waiting on more guidance from the SBA about it, and we are still waiting on more guidance from the SBA about it. That was a similar footnote in the new rule saying that there will be guidance forthcoming. So we are still waiting on that. The next reduction exception is the last bullet point here on the screen, which is employees who during the covered period or the alternative covered period, whichever one you choose to use, were fired for cause, voluntarily resigned, voluntarily requested and received a reduction in their hours. And in all of these cases, you're only going to include the FTEs on this line if the position was not filled by a new employee. So you don't get the benefit of both. So you don't get the new employee and you get an exception for the old employee. If somebody has been hired into that spot, you would just count the new employee. Okay, next slide. Okay. So the average FTE reduction calculation. So these are going to be your look back periods to determine how your FTEs have changed. So you have a few different options here that the SBA gives the borrower flexibility about. So the first is reference period 1, February 15th through June 30th, 2019. The next period is January 1, 2020 to February 29th, 2020. Or if a borrower is a seasonal employee, they can use option 1 or option 2, or they can use any consecutive 12-week period between May 1, 2019 and September 15th, 2019. Okay, next slide. Okay, so since I have now explained how you do the calculations, now we bring this all together. So as mentioned, you're going to put your reduction calculations in either for the FTEs, the second to last column, or for the salary and wage reduction calculations in the very last column. And you're going to use those numbers in boxes 2, 3, and 5 in now your FTE reduction calculations that you see here. If you're following along with the actual application, you're going to flip to the previous page, which is page 3, which we're now on PPP Schedule A, but we're all the way at the bottom now. Talking about the reduction calculation. So as mentioned here, we've already determined if a safe harbor has been met or not. So that's the first part. And then if you don't satisfy the safe harbor, then you'd actually now run the numbers for your reduction quotients. So in this case, as mentioned before, the employer did go and restore its FTE headcounts by the end of their covered period. Which is obviously, of course, before December 31, 2020. So they would qualify for safe harbor number 2. They would not qualify for safe harbor number 1 in this situation. And they would not qualify for the top there, the no reduction in employees or average paid hours, because there obviously was a reduction here. So for line 11, you're going to put the number of average FTEs during the borrower's chosen reference period, which is what I just talked about on the previous screen. And again, you have to use this same method for your reference period and your covered period of how you calculate the FTEs. That's very important. Line 12, you're going to go and place the number of your total FTE, which on the previous box is going to be your boxes 2 and 5, but it's also on the top of this particular page, the Schedule A, lines 2 and 5. So it's actually the same numbers, which in this case was 6. And then here, because the safe harbor was met, we have a 1.0 for our reduction quotient, which goes on line 3. If the safe harbor wasn't met, then there would be a number less than 1 or less than 0.1 here on this line, which we would then use later as the reduction quotient for how much your forgiveness has been reduced by for not restoring your FTEs. Okay, so that is the FTE and the salary reductions, how to calculate those and go through the worksheet. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Liz, who will talk through the rest of the PPP Schedule A form. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kate. Okay, so now we're in the middle section that I had referenced to in the beginning of this webinar. We're on Schedule A, but at the top of the sheet, and Kate was just at the bottom of that sheet. So the first part of Schedule A is really simple. You've already done the hard work. You're just going to enter in all of the worksheet numbers. So line 1, you're entering the cash compensation, box 1, from table 1 from the worksheet. Line 2, you're entering the average FTEs from table 1. And then line 3, you're entering the salary or hourly wage reduction calculations from table 1, in particular box 3. So just plugging in those numbers that you already calculated. Same goes for table 2 in lines 4 and 5 of the Schedule A. You enter in the cash compensation from table 2, which is box 4. And then you enter in for line 5 the average FTEs that you had calculated from box 5 of table 2. Next slide, please. All right, now we're getting into a little bit more of new information on the Schedule A. We're getting into non-cash compensation payroll costs that we have not covered yet. This includes health insurance and employee retirement plan contributions and state and local taxes. So here in line 6, you enter in the amount, the employer contribution for employee health insurance. Line 7 is the contributions for employee retirement plans, and line 8 is state and local taxes. Importantly, we discussed earlier regarding the alternative payroll period that cash compensation can be paid or incurred to be an eligible forgivable cost. For these non-cash compensation payroll costs, it's only costs that are paid during the covered period, not incurred. All right, moving on to compensation to owners, line 9. Kate touched upon this, that amounts paid to owner employees, self-employed individuals, and general partners are not included in the worksheet calculations. we enter in all of the compensation to owners in line 9. So if you have an 8-week covered period, the amount that is paid per owner employee is the lesser of 2 out of 12 months of 2019 net profit, or $15,385. That's for the 8-week period per owner employee. For the 24-week period, it is a lesser of 2.5 out of 12 months of 2019 net profit, or $20,833. So you enter in all those amounts in line 9. And then line 10, you're just adding up these amounts. 1 and 4 was from the previous slide, which is the cash compensation totals from tables 1 and 2 from the worksheet. And then these non-cash compensation payroll costs and compensation to owner totals. And that's where you get your total payroll costs. Next slide, please. All right, so we're back to where we started. We're on the first page of the application. We're on the forgiveness calculation form. Line 1, you're going to plug in the payroll costs that we had just calculated from Schedule A. And now we're going to go into non-payroll costs, which we have not covered yet. These are mortgage interest payments, rent and lease payments, and utility payments. So we enter all these costs. So importantly, and similar to the alternative payroll covered period so all non-payroll eligible costs are eligible for forgiveness if they are paid or incurred during the covered period, even if the billing date is after the conclusion of the covered period. So by way of example, let's take our covered period in this application, which is May 1st to June 25th, and talk about utilities. So let's just say April's utility bill is billed in May. That April bill that is billed in May is forgivable because you pay that bill in May. Same goes for May's utilities that is paid for in June. But June's utility bill that would presumably be billed in July, the portion of utilities that falls within the covered period in June, while the bill is after the covered period, that portion of June utilities is forgivable if it's within the covered period. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we're almost at the finish line here. So line 5, further on the first page of the application, you enter in the total salary or hourly wage reductions that we had calculated all the way back in the worksheet. Now we're going to add the lines of the previous slide. So these are payroll costs from line 1 plus 2, 3, and 4, which are the non-payroll costs. And then also subtract line 5 from this. So reduce it by the salary or hourly wage reductions. And now line 7 talks about the FTE reduction quotient that Kate went into during the worksheet, and also at the bottom of Schedule A. So here our reduction quotient is 1 because it is not reduced because we met a safe harbor. But as Kate explained, if you did not meet a safe harbor, this amount would be less than 1. Now we're going to move down to line 8 where you apply the FTE reduction quotient. And here again, it doesn't change because our reduction quotient is 1, but if it was less than 1, that it would be lower. All right, then line 9, you enter in the PPP loan amount, which is $125,000 in this circumstance. The forgiveness amount cannot exceed the loan principal amount, which is why this is here. And now we're going to go to the payroll cost 60% requirement. As you may have remembered, it used to be a 75%, 25% breakdown of the permissible costs. So 75% had to be towards payroll costs and 25% non-payroll costs. That requirement is now 60%. So in order to make sure that this requirement is met, you divide line 1, which is your payroll costs, by 0.6. And here you can see that the amount is far over any of the other amounts. And so if your payroll costs were closer to that 60% threshold, this number would be much lower, if not lower than it would be lower or equal to the modified total, if not less than the modified total. And then finally, line 11, you pick the smallest of lines 8, 9, and 10, and here that is line 8 for us, and that is your forgiveness amount on your application. Next slide, please. Okay, now I just want to bring your attention to the representations and certifications of this application, which you should really take the time to review before you submit this application to your lender. These representations and certifications include, but are not limited to, that the use of these funds only for the eligible purposes under the program, that your application is true and accurate, that you have maintained adequate documentation. Next slide, please. Also, I'd just like to point your attention to a certification that you understand and acknowledge and agree that the SBA may request additional information for purposes of evaluating your original eligibility for the PPP loan, as well as for loan forgiveness, and that failure to do so may request a determination that the borrower was ineligible for your PPP loan or an outright denial of forgiveness. Also, for borrowers who rely on the FTE reduction Safe Harbor 1, you have to certify as to the accuracy of that. That Safe Harbor 1 for FTE reductions, as a reminder, was that you were unable to operate at full levels due to OSHA, CDC, HHS, and or state or local shutdown orders. And then lastly, you certify that you understand that knowingly making a false statement to obtain forgiveness of this loan forgiveness is punishable under law by imprisonment of not more than 5 years and up to a fine of $250,000. So if you have any questions or concerns about these representations and certifications, we'd be happy to assist you. All right, now I'm going to hand it off to Kate again.
Okay, thanks, Liz. All right, so we just went through the loan forgiveness regular application. So this is going to, most borrowers are going to use that application, primarily borrowers who have various reductions in either the FTEs or salaries, employee salaries. So next, what we're going to talk about is the PPP loan forgiveness application form easy. So this is a new document that the SBA released here within the past couple of weeks, really in response to the various calls by Congress and by the public about how complicated everything we just talked about is for small businesses to have to go through to calculate loan forgiveness. So the SBA released the new form, and the new form allows only certain borrowers to use it to apply for forgiveness using the easy form. So as you can see here on the screen, we have the 3 scenarios. The first is the very easy scenario. It's a self-employed individual, sole proprietor, independent contractor who has no employees at the time of the loan application and no employees at the time of the forgiveness application. So it's just one person. You can use the easy application here. The next 2 are both, there's a slight nuance between the 2 of them, but for both instances, it is an employer who has not reduced salaries of its employees more than 25% during the covered period or the alternative covered period compared to the look-back period. And in situation 1, which is box 1 that you see here, the borrower did not reduce the number of employees or the average paid hours between January 1, 2020 and the end of the covered period. So there was no salary reduction and there was no FTE headcount reductions. And then the third type of borrower who can use this type of form is going to be, again, a borrower who has not reduced salaries in excess of 25%, and the borrower was unable to operate during the coverage period or at the same level of business activity as before February 15, 2020 due to compliance with OSHA requirements, CDC requirements, HHS requirements, or state or local executive orders. Here in New York State would be the executive orders. So these are the employers who can use the easy form. So when you decide to use the easy form, if you qualify, you're going to check which box on the easy form that you qualify for, and you're gonna have to make certain certifications regarding that, which I'm gonna talk about here in a second. In the meantime, Kathy, next slide, please. Okay, so when you're looking at this, the first page of the easy application looks very similar at the top to the regular application. In fact, it's nearly the same. So we're not going to go through all of this in detail again. At the top, obviously, we have the business name and then your basic information about the loan amount, your employees, if there's an EIDL advance again, your payroll schedule, and then your covered period or your alternative covered period. And then, of course, the question about if your loan is in excess of $2 million. As we talked about in previous webinars, the $2 million question here, literally it's the $2 million question, is regarding the certifications that were made regarding loan necessity, that there was a lot of discussion about at the end of April and the beginning of May about that threshold that the SBA was going to deem borrowers who were under the $2 million threshold to have made the necessity certification in good faith. So that is what that line there is getting at. Okay, Kathy, next slide, please. Okay, so this is now the bottom of the easy application. So again, very similar to the regular application, except that you don't have to go backwards and do all of those reduction calculations because you're certifying that you did not reduce your salaries in excess of 25%, and that you're also certifying that any FTE reductions either didn't happen or were the result of government orders. So for line 1, you're going to put your payroll costs in. You're going to then put your non-payroll costs, so your mortgage interest payments, your rent, your lease payments, and your utility payments. The calculations that Liz talked about a few minutes ago, how to calculate those are all the same here regarding your paid and incurred calculations. All right, line 5, again, very similar to the regular application. You're going to add lines 1 through 4 together for your forgiveness amount. And then line 6, again, you're going to put your PPP loan amount. And then line 7, this is going to be related to the 60% requirement. So for anybody watching and who has watched previous webinars, we've talked a lot about the old 75% requirement, which was the SBA required at least 75% of loan funds to be used on payroll costs. That was changed in the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act a couple of weeks ago, that now it is 60%. And keep in mind, it's 60% of your forgiveness amount has to be used on payroll funds, or you're going to, payroll expenses, I should say, or you're going to see a reduction in your forgiveness amount. So what's important here is that it doesn't prohibit you from seeking forgiveness if you use more than 40% on non-payroll expenses, but it will reduce your forgiveness amount. So for here, that's how we get this calculation here, is dividing your line 1, your payroll costs, by 0.60. And then finally, line 8 is going to be your forgiveness amount, which is the smallest of lines 5 through 7. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as mentioned, there are, of course, representations and certifications for the easy application as well. Most of the certifications are very similar to the certifications and representations that are made in the regular application. However, we do have 2 new ones, and those relate specifically to the ability for a borrower to use the easy application instead of the regular application. So as you can see, the top one here is would be checked if the borrower did not reduce salaries by more than 25% during the periods mentioned. And then, of course, then you can see at the end, the last sentence there about not counting employees who are making over $100,000 per year. And then the borrower must certify to one of the next 2 boxes, which is either that the number of employees or average paid hours of the employees was not reduced during the periods that are mentioned there. And then again, you don't count reductions that arose from the inability to rehire individuals or similarly qualified individuals, or situations where a borrower tried restoring hours and couldn't. So that's box 1, if you can certify to that one. If not, then you would be relying on box 2, which is the new exception for not being able to operate at pre-pandemic levels because of compliance with HHS, CDC, OSHA, or state or local requirements to maintain the standards for sanitation and safety and social distancing related to COVID-19. So in order to use the application, you'd have to certify to one or the other of these certifications. All right, next slide. Okay, so you have heard me talk about this quite a bit on many webinars, and you have heard Jeffrey talk about this on many webinars, the importance of documentation. You are not escaping another webinar where we're not going to talk about how important documentation is. So there's really 2 buckets of documentation. The first bucket is related to documentation that needs to be submitted with your forgiveness application. And then the second bucket is documentation that is submitted that you have to maintain for a period of 6 years, and that the SBA can ask for either while they're reviewing your forgiveness application if they need more information, or during an audit sometime after your forgiveness application has been approved. So here on the screen, we have documentation that needs to be submitted with your application. So there's really no big surprises here. And this is all laid out in detail on the last page of the forgiveness application instructions. So the big highlights here is you're going to have to show documentation related to your payroll costs. So as you can see here, your bank account statements, your third party payroll statements, receipts, canceled checks, all showing how much you've paid, your state and federal taxes that were paid, all documenting your payroll costs. For your FTE headcounts, you need to submit documents proving what your FTE counts were during both the reference periods, so those 4 periods that we previously talked about, and the covered periods. You need both there. Finally, for your non-payroll costs, you also need to submit documentation evidencing that. And as you can see here, it's going to be mostly your cancel checks, your receipts, and then really the invoices or lease agreements where the obligations spring from. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what you see here is your documents that you have to maintain, but do not need to be submitted with your forgiveness application. Again, we've talked about this before. You do not want to be in a position a year from now when you're trying to remember why you made a certain decision that you did, what your attempts were to rehire someone, what they said when they did it, when you were trying to find a similarly qualified employee, what you were doing. You don't want to be having to remember what you did and then try documenting it then. Document it contemporaneously while it's happening. Keep it in a file, keep it, whether it's a hard file or electronic file. That way you have it, and if the SBA asks for it during the forgiveness application period, you can provide it, or if they don't ask for it at that time, and there's an audit later, you can provide it to the auditor. So that's obviously extremely important. So as you can see here, these are documents that are required to be maintained, but do not need to be submitted. So these could be things just like what I was talking about, all of your supporting documentation for your Schedule A and your Schedule A worksheet that isn't otherwise submitted with the application, your job offers, your refusals, all documentation regarding that, your ability to rehire, information regarding your inability to operate due to compliance with state and federal orders. So these are the type of things that you should be keeping and maintaining and having in case the SBA asks for it later. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jeffrey.
Great. Thanks, Kate and Liz. It was a great presentation, a lot of detail on the forgiveness application, both the full and the easy form. So we have recorded this presentation. It will be available on our on the BSK website together with the materials, and that'll be available within I think the next day or so. If there were a lot of great questions today from people on the application themselves, and both Kate and I will be presenting tomorrow during our weekly Tuesday webinar. And I think what we'll do is go through a number of these questions, sort of like FAQs, tomorrow during our 16 minutes of time, and try and answer as many as we can. Some of the questions had to do, and I think, I know we're at the end of our 45 minutes, but one question was, can we cut the 24 weeks short? And you are allowed to apply for forgiveness prior to the 24-week period, but you do have to certify essentially that you are maintaining your FTE count and maintaining salary so you don't fall below that 25% threshold during the 24-week period. Tomorrow we'll also answer some specific questions about how to count FTEs. There are a number of great questions on that today, and we'll go through that tomorrow in a little more detail. So people can sign up for the Tuesday webinar series on our coronavirus page on the Bond website. So that's available for people to sign up. And if anyone, as they're going through their forgiveness application, wants some assistance or have questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Liz, or to Kate, and we'll get you the answers that we can. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to Kate and Liz for your great presentation. And we hope to see everybody soon. Please stay safe and healthy and out of harm's way. Take care.